Morning, everybody. It's very nice to be here. It's a very nice stage. Hope somebody can take a picture of me so I can show my mother. All right, so my name is Seán Donnelly. I'm an analyst at Econsultancy, where I work on producing research in terms of our trend-based reports, but then I also kind of work on best practice guides. And from time to time, I get invited out to speak at kind of gigs and events like this. But I'm always quite conscious, actually, that when I do, while my background is in applied digital marketing research, whereby I worked at a university in Dublin for about 5 years, and we worked on kind of testing different kinds of tools and tactics to see what worked and what didn't work, so we can kind of recommend strategies to our industry partners. But in the last couple of years, I very much spend most of my time behind the desk. And I'm conscious that sometimes I can kind of talk about things and preach and kind of say, you need to be doing these things and those things, but I don't get my hands dirty with these things anymore. So if I say anything today that you think, actually, Seán, I don't agree with that, whatever, by all means, put your hand up or send me an angry email or a tweet or something like that. All right, so today we're going to talk about our annual email marketing industry census. And we've been working on this now for 11 years with Adestra. No offense to Adestra, but I'm glad to say I haven't been working on this for 11 years. I've just been working on it for 2 years, because I've only been at Econsultancy for 2 years. But what's interesting about it is, because we've been managing this research for so long, we've been able to have a nice eye for some of the trends that have been taking place. And people kind of find this report quite useful, actually, because it provides a nice baseline in terms of something to compare your own organization's approach to email marketing to. And to some extent, sometimes people find some of the stats in here quite cathartic, because they can see, well, actually, if you're being hard on yourself and thinking, we're not doing as well as we could be, you'll see, well, actually, there's other organizations face similar kind of challenges. In terms of the sample size that we used, we surveyed 1,200 marketers this year, so it's quite statistically significant. So hopefully you will find some of these trends quite interesting. You'll notice here, so some of the kind of the things that insights we tried to pull out were very much focused around personalization, device optimization, and automation. And then we've got somewhat of a look to kind of what's going to happen in the next kind of 2 to 3 years. Part of my job is about kind of identifying and analyzing and to some extent evaluating different kinds of digital trends. And some of those trends have the potential to impact not just our job or our company, but our entire industry. And some of them kind of pass off unnoticed. So in the last year, for example, we've had Pokemon Go, which I'm assuming is dead now. I don't know. Do people still play that? But we've also seen kind of the growth in things like programmatic ad trading and some of the issues that kind of go hand in hand with that in terms of fraud and transparency and stuff like that. So with that in mind, we kind of have this, if you look at this curve, I kind of liken it to Moore's Law, if you have heard of Moore's Law. If you haven't, Gordon Moore, one of the founders of Intel, posited all the way back in the 60s that computational capacity was doubling and becoming cheaper, or reducing in price by about half, around about every 18 months to 24 months. And actually, that kind of hypothesis has been surprisingly robust in the years since. And some people say, well, actually, this kind of started before he suggested it in terms of the rate of technological change. And with that in mind, for us as individuals and for our businesses, this can be incredibly stressful, or it can be very exciting, depending on your point of view. But the thing is, like, as human beings, we're analog, we're not digital. We can't just install more memory or more RAM to speed up how we do things. So we kind of have this challenge in terms of how do we keep up to date with all of these different technological advancements. And particularly in the marketing space, I'm sure you've seen that slide lots of times with all of the different marketing technology vendors and how they are growing or multiplying exponentially in the last kind of 10, 20 years or whatever. So that's kind of stressful. But I think in terms of thinking about this, as marketers, sometimes we are the ones who are expected to have our eye on the ball and know about the next emerging technology. And also sometimes we're put under pressure by our CEO who's read about something in an in-flight magazine somewhere and says, I want you to start kind of implementing this tactic or start using this kind of tool. And maybe we can take our eye off the ball sometimes. So we are kind of in this sort of constant state of beginning as marketers, which can be exciting, but can also be a little bit stressful. But I would suggest that despite all of these new channels, tactics, and devices and so on, maybe we need to evangelize email marketing a little bit more. In terms of digital tactics, it has been around the longest. And as we'll see as we go through some of these trends, maybe we're not utilizing it as much as we possibly could be. So in the kind of, we've had in the last 10 years a kind of a rush to create a mobile app, and 7 or 8 years ago we had the kind of the social media frenzy and so on. But email, despite being around for 30 years, it's quite robust. It's low cost, or reasonably low cost in terms of other tactics. It's high yield, it's very measurable. It gives us an opportunity for one-to-one, quite meaningful interactions. And it's measurable. And it's something that we can build quite nice behavioral models around. So I don't need to read through some of these stats. I'm sure you know some of these things. But in terms of consumer research from DMA, you can see here that about 76% of consumers say that email is a nice channel to receive and consume information. And I don't know about this 42% one. If you're one of those people, you know yourself. You don't need to put up your hand or anything like that. So, okay, let's get into this. Most people acknowledge that email marketing delivers a very strong return on investment. But maybe we haven't got as much of a strategic focus on it as we could. In terms of the 11 years that we've been running this research, we kind of have this quite consistent picture in terms of when we ask marketers which tactics return for you or which disciplines are the best in terms of return on investment. We've kind of seen this leapfrogging between SEO and email marketing. And for anyone who is involved or does any work with SEO, you'll know that almost every other month we'll see some kind of article saying, is SEO dead, or something like that. And it's not. These things are just changing. But it's interesting in terms of these two tactics. They've been around for a long time. And there's a clear acknowledgement that they work for us, that they kind of return for us. But there's also a bit of I'd suggest, a chronic underinvestment, certainly in email marketing. So this is a cross-tabulation from our research. A cross-tabulation is basically just comparing the results from two different questions. And what we can see here is basically the return on investment when marketers carry out advanced email marketing segmentation. What we can see here is that email, this kind of consistent gap between email returns for us around 20%, but this year our marketing budgets only reflect about 15% in terms of what we spend on email. So maybe email requires certainly a bit more time, but also a little bit more investment to get a bit more out of it. By the way, when we did this survey, just a kind of a separate note that I don't have at the slides, for those companies that spend more than 10% of their marketing budget on email, they report twice the amount of return on investment than those companies that spend less than 10%. So that's in terms of kind of a baseline or a benchmark. It would be an interesting one to think about in terms of your own business. In case we need further proof of this, if we look at kind of personalized, hold on, I'm skipping ahead here. We can see here, it's kind of following on from what we just said. Those companies that engage in advanced segmentation, we can see here 38% say excellent return on investment, whereas those that don't, we can kind of see this curve down the other end where we see almost 40% say that they have a poor return on investment. So if we think about the time that we spend on email, and in many cases, the people that don't do this are actually the ones who are managing email quite manually. So sometimes they're spending more time on it, but they're getting less bang for their buck, so to speak. So as you can see here, personalized emails, this is kind of third-party research as opposed to our own research, deliver 18 times the revenue than our old friends, the batch and blast. So in terms of talking about personalization, we won't spend too much time on this because you may know some of these cases already, but this is just to illustrate the value of personalization. So Naked Wines is a case study that we wrote about. An online wine retailer, really nice business. It's a subscription business, and it rewards its customers that it calls angels with kind of exclusive access and kind of good prices to wines from independent wineries. So you kind of have this nice two-sided thing where it works nicely for independent wineries and nicely for customers. And they deliver this quite high-touch, personalized service. And they wanted to reflect what they were doing with their service in terms of how they manage their email. I'm giving the game away there. So what they did was they kind of set up different kind of XML recommendation feeds to deliver personalized wine recommendations to their customers based on things like their account balance, wines that they had reviewed before, obviously emails by name and so on. And what was nice about some of these emails that they sent to people was, so not only were they personalized based on their preferences, but they included things like pictures of the wines that they were recommending. Very nice personalized approach beyond just name, which we'll see later on. A lot of marketers are still just using name in terms of personalization. And the result of that was, as I sort of gave the game away, they had this 40% conversion rate, but the real metric in terms of the bottom line, 7.9% increase in gross profit per customer. I understand there's going to be a base camp on personalization later on as well, which I think would be quite interesting. But when we ask organizations, well, where are you in terms of your approach to personalization? We can see here that nearly half of the companies or the people that we surveyed say, actually, we're only in the early stages of implementing personalization in their email campaigns, despite kind of the first commercial email being sent over 30 years ago. So it kind of brings us back to that point of the bright and flashy new tactics that sometimes we get focused on or we get stuck on, when actually we've got a tactic here that we appear to be underutilizing. We've got down the bottom here, we have 14% are not doing anything here. I don't know who those businesses are, but they've got some way to go. What I did think was nice about this, I haven't highlighted it, if we look at the top stat there, so the companies that can send emails based on individual activities and preferences throughout the funnel and that scale, that has doubled in the last year. So that's quite statistically significant, so it's an interesting one. If we look at some of the tactics, if we kind of want to drill down on a more granular level in terms of what organizations are doing with their personalization, we can see here that actually most say that they're only conducting basic segmentation. Now, obviously, depending on the survey participant, they might have their own understanding in terms of what basic segmentation is versus what advanced segmentation is. But if we consider, if we go all the way back to marketing 101, segmentation, targeting, positioning, it's interesting that actually the majority of respondents here say they're only doing basic segmentation, versus all the way down the other end of this scale, we have only a quarter of our respondents say that they're doing behavioral targeting, despite research that suggests that organizations that can do behavioral targeting well can receive up to about 600% uplift in terms of conversion rates versus kind of old-fashioned batch and blast. So what are the issues in terms of carrying out personalization? Well, I didn't want to kind of give you too many nasty kind of charts from our report, so I just took out the top 3. And you can see here, so we've got integrating data, lack of resources, and time. And they're not necessarily discrete challenges. I think these things kind of sit quite closely together. So integrating data is time-consuming, and a lot of companies don't have the resources to spend the time to go back and do all of this. And I'd suggest that maybe AI, which we'll look at briefly later on, might actually be a big help to us in this as we go forward. So, moving on to optimization. Nice example here from Sephora in terms of an optimized email and then sending people through to a nicely optimized landing page. So this is good practice. But when we asked our sample, we can see that actually only about 2/3 say that they're using responsive email templates, and even less say that they are using responsive mobile landing pages. So that suggests that maybe there's a bit of a disconnect between the person or the team responsible for email marketing tactics and then somebody else who's responsible for managing the website, because these two things should really be the same. If you're doing better than this, great. If you're not, then this is an easy win that we can get right and certainly deliver better conversion rates. I think properly optimized landing pages, we can see nice, good conversion rates of about 20% more. There's a nice article in Harvard Business Review about a year or two ago about basically called "Is the Secret to Mobile Marketing Email?" And the premise of it is, or was, that kind of our mobile phone is kind of, it's a life management device. In fact, if we think of that back to that kind of exponential technological curve that we looked at a few minutes ago, if we think about mobile phones 20 years ago, maybe 25 years ago, they were kind of like yuppie devices, or some people thought of them as that. We couldn't have foreseen how much of a part of our life those things will become. But a lot of our attention lives with our mobile. Apparently, we check our phones about 50 times a day, which is a bit worrying. But it gives us a nice opportunity. One of the first things that many of us download on our phone is our email app, whether that's Gmail or Outlook or whatever. And from a consumer point of view, some of the research suggests that we look at about 60 to 80% of our personal emails on our phone rather than a desktop. So we've been talking about the year of mobile for years, but maybe actually instead of thinking of mobile as a channel, because it's not, it's a device, we think about, well, actually, how can we manage email better to reach people on their mobile phone? And what's good about mobile is we can use all sorts of nice triggers, like location triggers. So that can be like geolocation or kind of weather triggers based on where somebody is. And it's very personalized, one-to-one, and we can do it at scale. I don't need to read that one out to you. Kind of hammers home the mobile piece. But back to our tactics. So we looked at the basic segmentation piece and how people were getting on, but less than 1/3 of our respondents are doing things like content personalization. So we mentioned content personalization with Naked Wines, and we could very much see the business case there. advanced segmentation, behavioral targeting, and some of these things are probably easy wins for us. Again, some of the barriers in terms of device optimization, similar kind of challenges. Mostly, I would suggest around management and resourcing, kind of strategic, very much people-based issues. We can see here, only 17% of the issues that people acknowledge are technology issues. So technology isn't the problem, it's time and resourcing and so on. Moving on to automation, just to kind of contextualize what we mean here. So you may also be familiar with this. I think there might be somebody from NSPCC here, so I hope I get this right for you. But this is a nice example of purposeful automation and how it can be used to manage our time better, to free us up to focus on more value-added or value-adding activities, and then also increasing conversions. So let's go through this quickly. What did they do? They automated their weekly newsletter. They automated emails based on fundraising events to support kind of volunteers and participants with fundraising. But then they also took a nice leaf out of retailers' book, or kind of e-commerce retailers' books, where if they noticed that somebody hadn't completed a donation, they would email them in good time to say, we noticed that you've abandoned your cart, do you want to complete that donation? And the result was, so they freed up a lot of resource time to focus on kind of other strategic initiatives, and they kind of recaptured, the average kind of recaptured donation value was about £38 per person. So that's quite significant. So it's a really nice example of automation. And we mentioned batch and blast. It's easy to do. To some extent, we might still see somewhat of a return these days, although very small. But it's good we can see an increase this year in terms of the amount of marketers that are carrying out automation. So last year, I think it was 62%. This year, we're up to 67%. Clearly, we need to get better at the tactics. So while we're talking about automation here, we could see earlier on, most people are just doing quite basic segmentation or whatever. So there's still some wins that we can do. But I would suggest the better that we get at automation, the more time we will have to work backwards and dig down into the more strategic, granular tactics that we can focus on. We asked people about their email service provider and in terms of what is most valuable to them or what are they looking for. And I thought it was good to see that actually automation capability came top of the list. User-friendly interface, that makes sense, but price isn't necessarily the biggest consideration there. It's automation capability to help us kind of manage what we're doing a bit better. And if we think of NSPCC, if we can automate at the most basic level, then we have room for our kind of other kind of more higher order strategic activities. So we mentioned we're in this era of exponential change. We've got kind of, there's a lot of pressure to focus on the next trend versus the tried and tested approach that we had worked on in the past. And I suspect, actually, I was thinking of this as I was sitting down there and as Henry was introducing me, I'm probably not going to be the first person. I think maybe in every email marketing presentation somebody mentions this guy, Gary Thwerk, who notoriously sent the first so-called spam email all the way back in 1978. And he sent it to 400 people who were on the ARPANET, kind of a I can't remember that. I wrote it down, but I can't remember what ARPANET stands for. Advanced Research, something or other. He sent it to 400 people. He was trying to sell DEC computers, and lore says that he got a return of $13 million, which is pretty fabulous. Now, obviously, we can't expect that kind of return now, but we may laugh at this, but spam seems to be certainly a fairly loaded term. And as a consumer and an individual, spam can mean different things to different people. So while sometimes the marketer sending out the email might not think of it as spam, maybe we might think of it as spam. And I know sometimes at Econsultancy we run these roundtable events, for subscribers to come along, and they're kind of like discussions for people who manage a certain kind of activity. So we had an email marketing one about 6 months ago, and basically you get email marketers from different companies and different industries. They come along and they give out about the pressure that they're facing and kind of the challenges that they face. And one of the big things that always surfaces, kind of going back to that kind of batch and blast piece, is that you get some people who say, look, we're trying to take a really nice strategic approach to email marketing. Then we get to the end of the quarter, and the company hasn't met its targets, and somebody comes knocking on the door and says, we need you to send an email out to everybody to get rid of a load of inventory or so we can hit our targets and so on. And that's a challenge that we face, and it suggests that maybe email marketers or the email marketing team, they're not necessarily working as closely with other marketing practitioners in their organization as they could be. And that's not necessarily their fault. That might just be an organizational issue. In this kind of age of the customer, we kind of need to be very careful about the kind of the spam piece. And if you studied marketing at university or whatever, I'm sure you'd be very familiar with the 4 Ps: the product, price, place, promotion. And maybe we need to move on a little bit from that, actually, because that's very much focused on us. But there is a recognition nowadays that actually our brand belongs to the customer. Doesn't matter what we say, they are the ones that decide what our brand is going to be. So there's been a lot written in the marketing literature about customer experience in the last few years, and certainly in our own annual trends survey, we've noticed this kind of surface as being a key strategic area for a lot of businesses. And if we kind of work backwards on what that means, well, that kind of changes how we invest in our staff, deploy technology. If we want to focus on the entire customer experience, and by the way, we define customer experience as the experience that our customer has along all of the different touch points that they have with our brand and how they feel about those experiences. So if one of those touch points seems a little bit out of kilter, that might negatively impact their customer experience in some kind of way. So if we want to focus on customer experience, then we need to think about those touch points, and we need to make sure that they're integrated and managed in an integrated way, and that means changing our organizational structures so that people kind of work together rather than working discreetly, and sorry to use that horrible word, silos. So we need to focus on kind of more holistic and life cycle marketing. So we mentioned responsibility for email there, and in terms of kind of following up on that customer experience piece, we can see that individuals working on email marketing, there's less individuals saying that email is kind of their main thing now, and that's kind of a good thing to see. That would suggest that maybe they're working a bit more as part of teams. So if we look at the top slide there, team as part of wider marketing responsibilities, we can see here between 2014 and 2017, we've got more people kind of working more collaboratively. And that's a really good thing to see. And particularly, I always think as somebody with somewhat of a background in education, I mentioned I worked at a university in Dublin for 5 years. We were always very much focused on this idea of it's not just about learning tools and tactics and the mechanics of different kinds of interfaces. So for example, learning how to use the Google AdWords interface. We need to think strategically about these kind of things and not just become a technician. So we need to balance that kind of marketing, knowledge and awareness with our technical awareness. So I mentioned AI earlier on, so it seems to be the hot trend at any kind of conference or expo that you go to these days. The term seems to be a little bit like mobile. A few years ago, we've got kind of early adopters doing things, but it's not everybody is doing it yet. But I would suggest that AI is going to permeate all aspects of marketing in the next few years. In fact, I would posit that we're going to get to the stage in the next 5 years where we won't even be using the term AI because it will just be part of our different kinds of activities. And if we think about what that means from our point of view as email marketers, I suggest it will kind of permeate what we do kind of tactic by tactic, little bit by little bit, as opposed to this kind of big abstract kind of thing. So we can see here when we ask people, how do you think this is going to impact you? It makes sense. We see things like optimizing send times, improving subject line copy. We can already see lots of vendors selling tools, doing these kinds of things. And while they might sound or seem kind of simple, the reality is some of these things, just automating subject line copy, can really deliver on the bottom line. So we couldn't get through a presentation on kind of email without mentioning GDPR. We won't labor the point on this, but what I think is really interesting is that we have less people this year than last year saying that they are compliant with GDPR. And in fact, at Econsultancy, we can certainly see it that just in terms of searches for GDPR alone on our site, and when we look at Google Trends, there's a little bit of a panic on the moment where people are kind of going, okay, actually we need to get up to speed on this. And there's also a bit of confusion in terms of, well, actually, who is responsible for GDPR? Is it the marketing person? Is it the CTO? Is it our head of legal? And so on. But it is good to see that over the far side of the screen there, we can see we were not aware of any legal changes that might affect our activities. Last year it was 24%. When we did this survey, which is about 4 or 5 months ago, it was down to 16%, and I would suggest it's lower now. Okay, so let's finish up, because I am just over time. I mentioned the value of balancing our marketing knowledge with technical knowledge. And that's really important, particularly if we think back to our discussion of SEO and email marketing. The era or the time of being able to do nice tricks, like buy lists for email or kind of black hat SEO, that's gone. We need to think very strategically now. And if we think back to that kind of exponential technology curve that I mentioned at the start of the session, we can't keep up to date with everything, but we do still very much need to be aware of those technological changes, so that we can ask the right questions in terms of, well, what does this technology change mean to me, my organization, my profession, and so on. So with that in mind, I would always suggest to people you should spend 5 to 10% of your time kind of managing your learning. I kind of changed this chart here just to suggest we need to balance tech expertise with marketing expertise and not necessarily leave email marketing to the technician that knows the interface. That is really important. That person can certainly be the evangelist, but we also still need to balance it out with our fundamentals of kind of marketing strategy and so on. And those things don't change as much. So that's me. If you have any questions, comments, critique, email me, tweet me, and I would encourage you to download that report because there's a lot more good stats and details in it. Thank you very much.